Welcome, welcome, welcome everybody to Bahai.chat, a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of mankind, led by individuals who are putting these principles into action. We have no clergy in the Baha'i faith. One of our most fundamental teachings is independent investigation of truth. If you aren't already in contact with a Baha'i and would like a bit of virtual one-on-one accompaniment to begin such an investigation, where you can ask questions, be guided to materials that would especially resonate for you, or be introduced to the Baha'is and community building activities in your area, we invite you to connect with our Baha'i Guide program. You'll get a personal invitation to connect in whatever virtual way you would like at a time that works for you. For more details, simply send an email to info@Bahai.chat and write guide in the subject line. To get us started with a brief overview of the Baha'i faith, it's my pleasure to introduce Bahai.chat producer and my co-host, David Hoffman.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. The Baha'i faith is the youngest of the independent world religions. It's part of the ever unfolding plan of God to carry mankind forward to our ultimate spiritual destiny. Its primary and most fundamental teaching, proclaimed in no uncertain terms by its founder, Baha'u'llah, is the oneness of the world of humanity. Over a century and a half ago, in 1858, an exile and a prisoner, Baha'u'llah revealed his hidden words in which he wrote this: "O children of men, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your heart how you were created. Since we've created you all from one same substance, it's incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land. That from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest." For nearly 200 years now, the Baha'i teachings have included the strongest of admonitions against prejudice, racism, and every form of othering. For Baha'is, this year has special significance. This year we celebrate the 100th year anniversary of the passing of Abdul-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, the appointed center of his covenant and the sole interpreter of his writings. In 1908, after nearly 60 years of prisoner and exile, Abdul-Baha was finally freed. 4 years later, in 1912, at the age of 68, he traveled to the United States, bringing the teachings of his father to the West. At that time, as we are today, America was torn with racial division. Separate but equal was the highest level of interracial relations to which the nation aspired. During his 239-day journey throughout America, Abdul-Baha gave hundreds of talks, the subjects of which appeared in dozens of articles and publications. It was revolutionary at the time, but he pulled no punches, challenging Americans to go beyond tolerance, to embrace diversity completely, and to demolish racial barriers in law, education, even marriage. After Abdul-Baha's passing, his grandson, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, wrote at length about racism in America. In his Advent of Divine Justice, published in 1938, the Guardian wrote this: "As to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. The ceaseless exertions which this issue of paramount importance calls for, the sacrifices it must impose, the care and vigilance it demands, the moral courage and fortitude it requires, the tact and sympathy it necessitates. Invest this problem, he writes, with an urgency and importance that cannot be overestimated. As Baha'is, we have from the earliest days of the faith in America been called upon to grapple individually and at the community level with the pernicious disease of racism, realizing that it takes commitment to often difficult and uncomfortable action. First and foremost, in self-reflection, recognizing that we Baha'is are far from immune to the tendencies created in all of us by the terrible impact of systemic, rampant, often subconscious expressions of prejudice and hatred that create hardened barriers of otherness. One of the necessary first steps in moving toward the elimination of racism is to understand that much of our history has been whitewashed. It's time for us all to make efforts to learn the truths of our past, including all of its troubling details. So today, our special guest is Bob Henderson, and the topic, From Slave Patrols to Modern Day Policing. Mr. Henderson holds a degree in psychology. He retired from law enforcement after 26 years of service. Bob is an advocate for social justice and has dedicated his life to the study of African American history. Over the years, Bob has been instrumental in assisting Baha'is and non-Baha'is alike with a basic understanding of the historical effects of racism in America, and helped to clarify the terms associated with race, prejudice, racism, structural racism, and colorblind racism. Bob's latest project is Slavery and its impact on present-day law enforcement. Bob, we're so delighted to have you. Welcome to the chat.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. There's so many different options you could have chosen and where you wanted to be today, but you chose to be here. And if you came here searching for a better understanding of what's happening within our criminal justice system, and in particular, law enforcement, you've come to the right place. Before we get started, I have a slide presentation I want to share with you, but before I do that, I wanted to share with you about the word justice. The word, as many of you know, has different interpretations depending on who you talk to and what articles and resources you're actually reading. But I wanted to share with you, and I kind of walk you through this process of my understanding of justice. The word is often used, but with many different interpretations as to what it actually means. However, there is very little doubt that the majority of people can immediately recognize injustice when they see it. For example, what comes to mind when I say slavery, Holocaust, income gap, hunger and food insecurity, or Japanese internment camp? You see how your mind immediately recognizes those things as injustice? Now, what do you consider as the standard for justice? And would you recognize it if you saw it? For some, justice means that people should only get what they deserve. But what if, under that definition, under those circumstances, someone decides that there are those who are undeserving based on the color of their skin? Would that be justice? Many think it is. In seeking answers as to what justice is and the standard for recognizing it when it's in operation, I read various journals on the subject, all of which were not comprehensive enough to address all of the challenges of our modern world. I also searched for these two answers in the writings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, of which I am a member. I was awestruck by the answers I found in just a few short words, wherein he writes, quote, "The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men," end quote. The word men, he's referring to all mankind. quote, "The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men," end quote. With that concept of justice in mind, I began reflecting upon its implication to society at large. If the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among all peoples, then you would also witness other principles such as equity and equality being fairly applied, regardless of one's skin color, gender, national cultural origins, or creed. I thought about a simple analogy on this point. Just as the human body maintains its internal order with all of its diverse organs and parts through a process known medically as homeostasis, justice, when properly implemented, would be the operating principle in society for maintaining our collective order. So there are 2 points about justice using this definition. One, because justice is an ongoing process, it might look messy at first, but in the end, it should maintain our collective order. 2, true justice is unapologetic in its expression and does not care about your feelings if you're operating in an unjust manner. In this definition of justice, each individual would be born into the world as a trust of the whole, and therefore deserving of all of its rights and privileges. I ask that you keep this definition of justice in the forefront of your mind as we navigate through this presentation, because ultimately, this entire presentation is about justice for everyone. Okay, so the overarching talk I'll be giving today is the history of racism in America. And the specific component I'll be speaking about today is going to be slavery and its impact on present day law enforcement. So I'm going to begin with a question for everyone that's here. Why is history important? Why is history important? I want to share with you a quote from George Santayana, and many of you are very familiar with this famous quotation, where he wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So when it comes to race and racism in this country, it is not that we cannot, in this country, remember our past. We literally have refused to acknowledge our past, and thus are condemned to repeat it. The reason why history is important is because it informs our laws, our policies, our decisions, and ultimately every decision we make. So what we have to do now to understand this issue of racism, how it's manifested within our criminal justice system, and in particular, law enforcement, we can't have that understanding unless we go back and really have a consultation with our history, right? To understand something there, because we've missed something in the process. And that's why we keep repeating the mistakes over and over again. As this quote says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So what I've done, being a former member of law enforcement, I've written a letter to my colleagues, to my fellow brothers and sisters in arms, to give them some sort of time in which they can reflect on what's happening within our country. And I wanted to share that with you. And I kind of did this in a bit of a poetic format. Dear brothers and sisters displaying the badge, the victims of injustice speak from their graves. So let's examine their fate. Here is a man whose only crime was being born Black, a man of African diaspora. You may have seen him before. Here is a man who was wronged by repeated blows from the master's cowhide whip, as he dared to say, "I am tired, O master, I simply need to rest." He was without guilt, without a trial, a man drowned in woe, showed no compassion, and cast into a lonely and forgotten pit. Here is a man who now speaks from the grave. He's been with us for nearly 402 years. Are you listening? His story is written in laceration and pain. Now, here is a man representing those who ran for the master's cowhide whip. He was running for his freedom and was paraded and beat into a bloody morass. Here is a man who is said to have had a mental illness because his spirit longed to be free, to break from the narrow cage of sorrow and injustice. Here is a man who now speaks from the grave. He's been with us for nearly 402 years. Are you listening? His story is etched in 1,000 wounds. Where is God's justice? I exclaim. Where is God's justice? I exclaim. Where is God's justice? I exclaim. My fellow brothers and sisters displaying the badge, where in the courthouse of public opinion do you stand? Mother Justice also cries from the grave. Will you stand alongside me, shoulder to shoulder in serried lines, and lift her up for all to cheer? The world stands by. They all want to know, is Mother Justice real or merely made of dust and clay, a figment born of showmanship and pride? She is telling us to go back, not forward, to learn from the past and listen to the Black voices of our dead, or suffer a fated rerun of history.
The death of an unarmed Black man.
George Floyd!
It has been incredibly difficult to prosecute a police officer successfully.
I'm here because I'm sick and tired of seeing Black men and women be killed and nothing be done about it.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
Jonathan Farrell was unarmed when he died, just a month shy of his 25th birthday.
Now that officer, Randall Carrick, is charged with voluntary manslaughter.
A mistrial was declared in the case of a white police officer who shot and killed an unarmed Black man. There were protests outside the court after the mistrial was announced Friday.
Shoot! Young and Black!
Don't shoot!
Unarmed!
Don't shoot!
Unarmed!
Don't shoot!
Death of Eric Garner
of a heart attack on Thursday. The father of 6 can be heard on the tape saying repeatedly,
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
There needs to be prosecution. That's what this is all about.
Many people simply cannot understand why the grand jury did not indict when they could actually see video of what went down between that New York police officer and Eric Garner.
Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old, was shot and killed during a struggle with a Ferguson police officer.
Officer Darren Wilson will not be indicted.
It's the feeling among many of these people that Black lives don't matter. Not one reason did this grand jury find to indict him.
I ask a question.
Yes.
How can we be promised that this injustice will happen again to another Black kid?
In another state tomorrow.
How can we assure our kids that they're safe out on the street with your officers?
That's my
That's
question.
what I want to know. I have a Black child.
Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke shot and killed 17-year-old Laquan McDonald.
For the first time in 35 years, a Chicago police officer is charged with first-degree murder.
That officer found guilty of second-degree murder. Very unusual, very important one.
It just goes to show you how serious that I am about my life and all these other lives that are out here that are scared of the police.
An officer shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice on Sunday.
Tamir Rice was playing with a pellet gun when officers arrived, and one of them opened fire within 2 seconds.
Grand jury decided not to indict the 2 officers who shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice.
Cleveland's prosecutor calls it a tragedy, but not a crime.
It doesn't even warrant a trial. That, in my mind, is unacceptable.
Think of the death of Freddie Gray.
All lives matters, but you got to think about who dying out here.
prosecutors in Baltimore dropped all remaining charges against 3 police officers in the Freddie Gray case.
Samuel DuBose was shot in the head Sunday
after being pulled over for a missing license plate.
Officer Raymond Tensing has now been charged with murder and voluntary manslaughter.
The only reason why Tensing is being charged is because there was a body cam. Yes.
Now those charges have been dismissed.
Black Lives Matter.
We will never get a conviction in this case.
In the death of Alton Sterling,
African-American man killed by police in Louisiana.
The Louisiana Department of Justice cannot proceed with a prosecution.
All we want is the same justice that they put against us whenever we go through certain trials and tribulations.
Philando Castile, a supervisor at a school cafeteria where kids loved him.
Police officer Geronimo Yanez shot Castile to death while he was in the car with his girlfriend and her 4-year-old daughter.
Jurors found Yanez was reasonable in his decision to shoot and kill Philando Castile during a traffic stop last July.
Under the circumstances, just because he was a police officer, that makes it okay.
I think the past two shootings with Alton and Philando have really sparked something.
There's people being murdered unjustly and not being held accountable. Cops are getting paid leave for killing people.
Former fans burning his number 7 jersey.
I hope you get cut.
40-year-old Terrence Crutcher was killed on Friday when local officers responded to a call of a stalled vehicle in the middle of the road.
12 jurors found TPD officer Betty Shelby not guilty of manslaughter in the shooting of Terrence Crutcher.
The facts were there. All the elements of manslaughter was there.
The death of 22-year-old Stephon Clark sparked nationwide protests.
Clark was hit 20 times. He was in his grandparents' backyard at the time.
This is what we have to do to not only this young man, but those who are going to come behind him.
Colorado police officers will not face charges saying they did not break any laws when they shot Stephon Clark in his grandparents' backyard.
And the same cop who killed him is back on the streets patrolling other communities, running through other people's backyards. I'm uneasy with that.
Anger overnight over the shooting death of 26-year-old Botham Jean in his own apartment.
Former Dallas police officer Amber Geiger is waking up this morning behind bars. She was found guilty yesterday of murdering her neighbor in his own home.
Tatiana is her name, and everyone is seeing that name on social media. There she is.
She was up playing video games with her nephew when she was shot and killed by former Fort Worth police officer Aaron Dean.
The Fort Worth police officer who shot at Tatiana Jefferson in her own home has been formally charged with murder.
Breonna Taylor.
A woman was shot and killed in her apartment.
George Floyd died in police custody after an officer pressed his knee into Floyd's neck.
Said, "I can't breathe," eerily similar to what we heard in 2014 with Eric Garner.
Black Lives Matter.
I filed an amended complaint that charges former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin with murder in the second degree.
George Floyd, whose killing by U.S. police triggered anti-racism protests right around the world.
Weeks of global protests and international support
and impact around the world.
Protesters marched once again in cities worldwide, demanding police departments change their tactics.
George Floyd! George Floyd! George Floyd!
So, as a reminder, the institution of our criminal justice system includes law enforcement, prosecution, and defense lawyers, and our courts and prisons. To understand its current functioning, it is essential that we look to its inception and then track its progress all the way to today. So for those who have come here looking for some sort of understanding of what's happening within our criminal justice system, and in particular law enforcement, we have to go back to its inception to have any sort of understanding of what's happening. So I want to begin by telling you that we're going to talk about a portion of the criminal justice system, that is law enforcement, but is part of a larger system of racism called structural racism. And structural racism is an analytical approach which examines the interrelationship among institutions for generating an understanding of the reproduction of unequal racial outcomes. So we're only going to take a component of this today, but it's part of a larger system that creates disparities for people of color. So we need to start, going way back to chattel slavery, we actually need to start from the beginning to have some sort of conception and understanding of what's actually happening. So chattel slavery was the owning of human beings and their offspring as property able to be bought, sold, given, and inherited. And to let you know right at the bat, chattel slavery, it was a complete process of dehumanizing people from Africa. The first slave arrived in the colony of Virginia in 1619. This involved the forceful kidnapping of African men, women, and children from all that they have known and stripping them from their culture, their history, their language, and their traditions, and bringing them to a completely foreign land. These were fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, husbands, wives, and grandparents. Africa has always been home to some of the oldest civilizations in the world, where they had kings and queens. But European colonization devastated traditional African societies and economies. Africans were not equivalent to wild beasts in the jungle, as were espoused by many who needed to be saved, which led to the white savior complex and the false rhetoric behind Africans being considered the white man's burden. Now, I want to tell you what's at the core of racism. So our nation was founded upon the false ideology of white supremacy, which is a spiritual and social disease created from a false belief in white superiority and Black inferiority. The after effect is anti-Blackness, resistant or antagonistic to Black people or their values or objectives. So the root cause is this false belief, this ideology in white supremacy, and therefore there's this belief in Black inferiority. And every cause has an effect, and the effect is anti-Blackness. And so at the core is this belief in white supremacy. And if you Google evolution, you will see this racial hierarchy, right? And Blacks in this racial hierarchy were considered less evolved, some subhuman, therefore inferior. So when you subjugate a people, you need to find some way to justify that subjugation. So Black people were not considered fully human. Now I want to talk to you and define some terms here, because a lot of people have come into the conversation with different levels of understanding about the word, in particular, racism. So I want to define this very clearly for everyone. Racism is an oppressive system with the following three components. One is racial prejudice. So anyone can be a bigot, anyone can have hatred towards other people. But when we're talking about in the context of the racism I'm referring to this idea of white superiority and Black inferiority as a belief, as an ideology behind all this, which leads to this belief in anti-Blackness. And then if you're going to have this belief system, and what makes this a racist system is that there's legislative power behind it. Who's sitting at the table making the laws? So along with this belief system are these laws that were put in place, which we're going to talk about. Now, if you have laws, you have to have some way to enforce those laws, right? A system of enforcement. And of course, when you have laws and you have the enforcement of those laws, that impacts the whole social system. So I want you to know that, chattel slavery was a system of oppressing people of color in every aspect. And it was done through legislative power along with enforcement. Now, here's some of the things that were enforced early on by the early precursors of law enforcement, called slave patrols. So here's some of the things they were enforcing. Lifelong bondage. Rejecting slavery was punishable by death. No right to bear arms or self-defense. No legal rights if accused of a crime. No right to own property. Prohibited from testifying in court against whites. Prohibited from congregating. Traveling restrictions. Prohibited from marrying, prohibited from reading and writing, permitted whites to inflict corporal punishment such as whipping, branding, maiming, and torture. You can see how brutal this system was. It's also 246 years of the rape of African-American women and children. It's a very, very brutal system. Everything was pathologized in the Black body. So the Fugitive Slave Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, requires a person held to service or labor who flees to another state or to be returned to his or her master in the state from which that person escaped. So we saw different iterations of the Fugitive Clause, 1787, and then it got progressively worse for those who try to escape, 1793 and 1850. As I mentioned, every aspect of the Black body was pathologized, even fabricated a term called drapetomania, which was a conjectural mental illness that in 1851, American physician Samuel A. Cartwright hypothesized as the cause of enslaved Africans fleeing captivity. The proposed cure? Whipping. Now, who was enforcing, as I mentioned, Black codes? In 1704, the colony of Carolina developed the nation's first slave patrol. Slave patrols helped to maintain the economic order and to assist the wealthy landowners in recovering and punishing slaves who essentially were considered property. Now, as I mentioned, slavery was a brutal and violent system, and the goal was to maintain social control. Now, if you're going to subjugate people, they're going to naturally rebel, right? Slave patrols occurred frequently. Slave rebellions, rather, occurred frequently. And therefore, so did the violence in an effort to prevent it. So the precursors to law enforcement were slave patrols designed to control the movement of Black people. Here's something that always just sort of turns my stomach when I see this. Slave patrol badge. You put your name there, do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among slaves in my district faithfully and as proud as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. So they're adding God in the picture here. It shows you how demented this ideology and how it impacted and affected people, both then and today. So now we're going to skip here to the Civil War, right? 1861, 1865. And let me make it very clear. The Civil War was not about state rights. It was about states' rights to maintain the system of slavery. And this resulted in approximately 600 to 800,000 soldiers dying from combat, accident, starvation, and disease. And you can say that this was a bit of a chastisement that God put in play here as a result of the behavior, centuries of torturing Black people. Now, let's skip to the 13th Amendment, which states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. We're going to talk about this a little bit further in a moment, but I wanted to share with you that prior to the 13th Amendment, the narrative was that Black men in particular were docile, naturally subservient, and childlike. After the passing of the 13th Amendment, the narrative changed to say that Black people were a danger to white people, particularly Black men being a danger to white women in terms of the potential of assaulting white women. Now, this was the genesis of Black skin being sort of, like I said, subservient and childlike and docile to this belief in that Black people represented this danger, right? And were basically criminalized in how they were viewed. And so it was not just a symbol of inferiority, it was also became a symbol of danger, right? Something to fear, you need to fear that Black skin. So we also entered, of course, the period of the era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. We can see here some of the first African-American senators and representatives here. So Blacks were, gaining some social power. Remember, part of that racialized system is social power through the right to vote. And I will tell you that the Reconstruction Congress was actually working. But we know that the presidential compromise of 1876 effectively ended the Reconstruction era. So by 1877, Southern Democrats' promises to protect civil and political rights of Blacks were not kept. and the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of Black voters. So, but what did come out of the era of Reconstruction were these amazing amendments. The 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person or of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Of course, the 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state or on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. I really want to make it clear to everyone here that these amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendments, were to help newly freed slaves. So there's something that was very specific, because white folks had all of these privileges, right? This was something very specific to newly freed slaves. So keep in mind, the 14th and the 15th Amendment were basically for Black people. Now, what was happening during this period, right? So you had the end of the Civil War, and you went from slave codes to what's called Black codes. So now you got the South after the Civil War completely devastated, right? The whole infrastructure was completely had completely crumbled. So white legislators created Black codes, and this resulted in a convict leasing program, a system of forced penal labor. And Blacks were then re-enslaved under the worst conditions, because when you go back to the 13th Amendment, you can see there's a loophole in here. Many of you are familiar with this. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So now you can be re-enslaved under the 13th Amendment if you can come up with some bogus laws and then basically put Black folks back in the prisons and therefore back in the fields. So this is one of the things that occurred. So what are some of the Black codes? Slave codes ended with the Civil War, but were replaced by other discriminatory laws known as Black codes during Reconstruction. And here's some of them here. Barred from engaging in certain occupations, barred from performing jury duty, barred from owning firearms, barred from voting and other pursuits, under strict vagrancy laws, under unfair labor contract laws, anti-enticement measures. So under strict vagrancy laws. So Black folks, Africans, were basically enslaved for 246 years. You know, there's no compensation. They had nothing, literally nothing. And so of course there's going to be homelessness. And so they turn that into a way in which they can arrest Black folks and do what? Put them back in the field. And this little note here says, Blacks who broke labor contracts were subject to arrest, beating, and forced labor. Apprenticeship laws forced many minors, either orphans or those whose parents were deemed unable to support them by a judge, into unpaid labor for white planters. I mean, if you look at the ages of these kids, I mean, they're really young people. They're really, really young here. And they were forced back into a life of slavery. So slavery, I want you to know, there's sort of this assumption that after the Civil War, great, slavery ended. It actually did not end. And as we navigate through this program, you'll see that it still hasn't ended. So Black codes were enforced by police and militia forces. So that's who's enforcing Black codes. Again, law enforcement, right? Black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia forces. And get this, often made up, if not completely made up, of Confederate veterans of the Civil War across the South. So now the South lost the war. They're pretty angry. They're pretty upset. Their whole infrastructure, the whole society has been flipped upside down. Now you have these folks, white militia, forming this police force that were now in charge of Black people. Do you think that was going to be a fair system in place? I think not. So by the end of the 19th century, all major US cities had police departments. Now, across the country, all you have to look at is the makeup of the people that are here, right? There's no diversity here. And yet we haven't cured the illness. Remember, what is the illness? What is impacting? What is the false ideology? White supremacy, right? So that hasn't gone away. So the Civil War, on paper said Blacks are free, but we haven't destroyed, we haven't cured the actual, ideological cancer that's been impacting our country since its inception, called white supremacy. So these folks are operating in that vein, right? And they've been doing so historically, from slave codes to Black codes. Now, what do we have next? Jim Crow laws. right? Jim Crow laws. We know that's about segregation, right? So you're free, but again, you see how this anti-blackness plays itself out. You're free, but we don't want you around. So we're going to segregate you from us, right? So public parks were forbidden. Theaters and restaurants were segregated waiting rooms in bus and train stations, water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, and cemeteries. Labor laws forbade African Americans from living in white neighborhoods. Segregation was enforced for public schools, phone booths, hospitals, asylums, jails, and residential homes for the elderly and handicapped. Some states required separate textbooks for Black and white students. Marriage and cohabitation between white and Black people was strictly forbidden in most southern states. Signs posted at town and city limits warned African Americans that they were not welcome. Who were enforcing these laws? Police officers. I want to make it clear that, we oftentimes think of the good, bad South and the good North. There was Jim Crow going on in the North as well. The North was not immune to Jim Crow-like laws. Some states required Black people to own property before they could vote, right? This is an example of aspects of voter suppression. Schools and neighborhoods were segregated and businesses displayed whites-only signs. During the Great Migration, let's actually do this. We'll do that. That's about the migration. We'll do that a little bit later. But I want to make it clear that the whole system in the United States was a system of segregation. I want to remove this false belief system that it was the South and the North was sort of this good place to live for Black people. It wasn't. We know that this was confirmed in a Supreme Court decision on Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where they said that the Supreme Court confirmed the separate but equal doctrine, and wrongly stated that it did not violate the 14th Amendment. Of course, this would be overturned many years later under the Brown versus Board of Education case between 1954 and 1955. And between 1860s and 1960s, thousands of Black Americans were killed in public acts of racial terror. We saw the uprising, after the Civil War, of a group that you all know, domestic terrorists called the Ku Klux Klan. But what I want you to know, this is kind of like this myth that there's a Klan and then the rest of the people were sort of, okay. The whole society was sick, right? So if you look at the picture here, I always say that there's sort of two victims here, two categories of victims. So clearly the people hanging from the tree are victims, right? But the people who are watching, who view this as a spectacle, right, the hanging of Black people, were also victims, right? Victims of this belief in their own superiority and the inferiority of Black people. And therefore, spiritually, they were apathetic to the suffering of others. And I want to keep in mind that this illness, right, this ability to be apathetic is how it impacts people who actually believe in white supremacy, right? Those who believe it can become sick with apathy. And therefore, you still see that prevalent in today's law enforcement system. So keep that kind of idea in the back of your mind as we move forward to help you understand what's currently happening within law enforcement. Now, we know that today, all of the sciences have confirmed our oneness to the degree that we are 98.9% genetically the same. That's been proven through, anthropology, psychology, physiology, and of course, in the field of genetics. So the reality of it is it's a false belief system, and that's been proven by science in all the religious books if read correctly. Okay, so now you have, all of this terror happening in the South, with lynching and just sort of the whole system was really corrupted. So and by the way, the KKK wasn't just sort of these toothless people from the hills coming down from the hills, right? These were your judges, your lawyers, or police officers hiding behind the cloth. So I want you to know that this is who the Klan was. And so it caused a lot of people in the South to basically flee from those areas. So about 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North and West between 1960 and 1970. So there was 2 world wars in there. So there were certainly some job opportunities that were present. But I want you to know that the Blacks ended up, when they got to the North, ended up in these very segregated cities. And so we saw the intentional outcome of, when you want to kind of fast forward this, with redlining, which occurred between 1934 and 1968 until the passing of the Fair Housing Act. But redlining created intergenerational poverty and the wealth gap between blacks and whites that looks more like an abyss. These cities are today infested with crime as a result of poverty. As I heard someone say, you can arrest someone for stealing a jacket, but when that person is released from jail, they are still cold. These cities are targets for racialized policing and tactics such as stop and frisk and pretext car stops, all designed to feed our prison industrial complex, right? The merging of our prisons, private prisons with businesses. We have made a business out of arresting people in this country. And the prime targets are African Americans and other people of color. In contrast, during the same period, 1934, 1968, mortgage loans were given freely to whites during this period and created the suburbs as we know it today. Now, stop and frisk and pretext car stops don't occur often in these areas, but unless there's a black person either living there or passing through, right? Driving while black is a term that you may have heard before. So I guess what I want to share with you is this is a tracking, this anti-blackness, this is the tracking of black people. So yes, we moved from the South to the North, but what was, these cities which were segregated, I guess what I'm trying to say is that what's the so-called ghettos that we know of was an intentional construction by our government, by the system. So I want to be very clear on that. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears here to kind of pull some things together. I wanted to talk to you about qualified immunity and its severe consequences. We talked about the 14th Amendment, right? As you can see here, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, right? And I'm just kind of skipping around here, nor to deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. In the 5th Amendment, right, to protect the right to vote. Good thing, right? And that was, again, to help newly freed slaves. And these are amendments for Black people. What has happened since then? Okay, so I want you to be aware of, if you're going to have some laws, or in this case, we're talking about amendments, you need something in place to say if you violate these amendments, because the Ku Klux Klan was just, it was just ravaging and just creating a bunch of problems for, of course, African Americans in regards to their ability to vote, and really using terror as a way to create voter suppression, right? There needed to be a way for the federal government to come in and help. So they came up with the Ku Klux Klan Enforcement Act of 1871, which states, every person under the color of statute, ordinance, regulation, custom, or usage of any state or territory of the District of Columbia subjects or causes to be subjected any citizen of the United States or other person within the jurisdiction thereof to the deprivation of any rights, privilege, or immunity secured by this Constitution and laws shall be liable to the party injured in an action, law, suit in equity, or other property proceeding for redress. So what does this mean for you? There's a lot of words there. It means it is a strict liability act. So it authorized monetary relief against anyone who, acting under the authority of a state law, deprived any person, particularly Black people, of their constitutional rights. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan Act was originally created to protect newly freed slaves from domestic terrorism. Here's something Black people aren't aware of, okay, is what's happened with this Ku Klux Klan Enforcement Act and how it's been interpreted today and what's been attached to it. What's been attached to it is qualified immunity. And before I read what that is, let me tell you that qualified immunity is one of the most aggressive and egregious legal errors in the history of the Supreme Court. And that's not hyperbole, that's just a fact. Qualified immunity eviscerates accountability for law enforcement and allows officers to violate someone's constitutional rights, commit aggressive acts of violence, and be able to use their badge as a get out of jail free card. Officers ultimately suffer the reputational loss when unprofessional officers commit misconduct. This doctrine breaks down public trust needed for law enforcement officers to do their jobs effectively. So what is qualified immunity? You all should be aware of this, right? This sort of nasty, dirty secret that's going on has been happening for several years now. The Supreme Court grafted qualified immunity onto U.S. Code Section 1983. Remember, this was a code to protect particularly Black people from terror, the right to vote, and all of those things. So how did the U.S. Supreme Court interpret this act, this Protection Act of 1983? The Supreme Court grafted qualified immunity onto U.S. Code Section 1983. Qualified immunity grants immunity to government officials such as police officers performing discretionary functions unless the plaintiff can show the official violated someone's clearly established constitutional or statutory rights for which a reasonable person should have known. So let me just kind of help you understand this a little bit better. In order to disqualify a police officer from being granted qualified immunity, you must show that the officer violated someone's clearly established constitutional statutory rights. Now, in contrast to that, if you cannot establish a clearly established case, now there's a prior case that was previously litigated, the officer would in fact be granted qualified immunity, even though they violated someone's constitutional or statutory rights. The only way I guess this would really make sense if I give a couple examples here, and I wrote a couple examples here with you so you can kind of follow along here. So Baxter versus Bracey, this is a case in 2004. This is the case where Officer Bracey was chasing, he's a canine handler, so he has a dog with him, a police dog, and he's chasing Alexander Baxter throughout this residential neighborhood, and they end up running down into a basement, and he's wanted, if I didn't say this, for a residential burglary. And when he gets down to this basement, he gives up. And basically he sits on the ground and he outstretches his arms. And for whatever bizarre reason, the officer releases his dog, and it pretty creates a lot of injuries to Baxter's upper body. And so he sues for excessive force. So for those who know about the law, so the burden of proof rests with the plaintiff. So it's up to the civil rights attorney, Alexander Baxter's civil rights attorney lawyer, to find an equivalent case. And they thought they did. So the case they were considering, in that case, the person was laying on the ground with their arms outstretched. Whereas in their case, Baxter was sitting on the ground with his arms outstretched. And because there was that trivial difference, the judge basically threw the case out and granted the police officer immunity, even though it was a clear violation of his constitutional rights in that case. So you can see how in that case, how these trivial differences doesn't allow someone, because they couldn't find a previous case that they had those same exacting facts, functional facts, the case was not acknowledged, and the officer was granted qualified immunity. Okay, Corbett versus Vickers, another example. So Officer Vickers is chasing a suspect, again, through a residential neighborhood. And the suspect runs into the back of someone's backyard where they're having some sort of family picnic of some sort. Now, the officer, of course, is not going to know the relationship between the suspect and the family. So when he gets to the backyard, this family is having, I guess I mentioned, a picnic. So he puts everyone on the ground, and there's children involved, and everyone gets proned out. He arrests the suspect, puts handcuffs on him, all is well, right? Well, what happened at that point was there was a dog that ran out of the house named Bruce. And to all accounts, Bruce wasn't being a threat to anyone. But the officer, for whatever reason, making this sort of bizarre decision, starts to shoot at the family dog, misses repeatedly, but strikes a child in the back of the knee. Of course, the mother, Amy Corbett, sues for compensation, as she should have. Now, again, it's up to the plaintiff to find in a similar case, an exact case where an officer violates someone's clearly established rights, or find a clearly established case where someone's constitutional rights were violated. And the civil rights attorney, although he looked very hard for this, was unable to find a case with those exact same circumstances. Why? Because it was so preposterous and bizarre what the officer did. And therefore, the Corbett family was unable to get any compensation for what they'd done for what happened to their child. although the officer violated someone's constitutional statutory rights and under those circumstances. So you can see how exacting the standard is, and it protects officers even though they violate someone's constitutional rights. So we're going to transition here to some of the problems within law enforcement in terms of accountability. For those who may not be aware, police unions, some of the most powerful labor groups are police unions. They exert a lot of control over local and state politics. Many have significant financial resources. They often lobby the respective city halls and state governments from passing laws that would increase transparency in regards to police brutality and reform. They often use their collective bargaining power to advocate for more leniency for abuse of power. So you can see, you get a flavor for the impact of police unions and how, why in the world, I did my job for 26 years, I never violated anyone's constitutional rights. So I don't need anyone bargaining for me for more leniency for abusing someone's rights. The net effect, it erodes full accountability. So you have a qualified immunity along with these strong police unions. The result is in mass incarceration. So if we looked at the dates here, mass incarceration really began in the late 70s and spiked, in the 80s and 90s. But when you look at the dates of these things, right? So you look at qualified immunity and when it actually started, 1982, right? That's significant for you to be aware of, right? The protecting of law enforcement from engaging in mass incarceration, right? We've made, basically arresting people a business. And look at the United States compared to other nations, like we're off the chart. So for every 100,000 people, we're putting 693 people in prison for every 100,000 people that are in this country. So we have made a business out of incarcerating people. And who are the people in these prisons? They're primarily people of color. And so here's some of the results of this. US accounts for 5% of the world's population, 25% of all people in prison in the world. Today, 2.3 million people are in prison in the United States. And although comprising only 30% of the United States population, 1 million are African American. If nothing changes, 1 in 3 males born in the United States today will go to prison compared to 1 in 17 whites. Minorities are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they're more likely to face stiff sentences. Okay, so I ask you, what is the cause and root cause of all of this, right? We can have amendments, we can have change of laws, we can have reforms, but we need to also acknowledge that there is something else operating in our country that is very significant. It's the ideology of white supremacy, a belief in white superiority and Black inferiority, creating anti-Blackness. And this is the actual illness. As I heard someone else say, you can take 2 pieces of bread and put a taco in between the 2 pieces of bread, and you call it a sandwich. But we all know that that's still a taco, right? And the point I'm making behind this is express this idea that we've seen different iterations of white supremacy operating in our country, and it's been called different names. So we went from slavery. Now we're looking at mass incarceration. It's another version of slavery, because that once you are a prisoner, once you have a felony record, right, you're stripped from all of the resources. You're from getting loans, from getting jobs, and from voting in many states, right? So there's a lot of issues when you get a felony record that pretty much strips you of a lot of your civil rights. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but in 2013, the Sentencing Project, which is part of the United Nations, they had this to say about what's happening within our criminal justice system. And they gave a verdict after they did their study, and they gave a finding. This has been kind of a bit of a cover-up, but it says that the government, referring to our government, continues to both foster and perpetuate inequalities in clear violation of its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as other international agreements, end quote. So what's happening within our criminal justice system is a human rights violation as confirmed by the United Nations. Here's another significant quote for you to be aware of. While the laws of the United States may be facially colorblind, a growing body of evidence shows that the individuals who apply such laws do not make cognitively colorblind decisions. As studies repeatedly demonstrate, the belief that the United States of the present is unaffected by the centuries of explicitly racist past, while perhaps well-intentioned, is at best wishful thinking and potentially blinds decision makers to the implicit racial bias that lingers in American consciousness. So we're going to talk a little bit later about implicit racial bias, how it impacts the entire system. And for those who may not be aware, our criminal justice system does not acknowledge implicit bias in terms of how the system operates, how law enforcement, how judges, lawyers, and how they all impact people, how they all do, make decisions, things like that.
The pulse of Black America is that we're grieving. This system, this society weathers us before we even come out of the womb. Because it weathers our parents' nervous system. There is a constant influx of cortisol and adrenaline in order to deal with this stuff. And so what we know is that toxic stress impacts every system of the body. When stuff like this happens, it is not just the grief of watching that brother be destroyed. It is the 400 years of grief that was never addressed. My son is learning how to drive, and it's terrifying me. It's terrifying me, and it's terrifying my wife, that he's gonna be out here. And I won't be with him. I'm sorry. If somebody did something to him, I would lose it. This can't go on. White people have to get their act together. This has to stop. This has to stop. I can't see another body. I can't watch the whole thing. I can't watch that. It's re-wounding and it's re-traumatizing. I can't do that. But if they do something to my baby, if they do something to my baby, I'm done. I'm holding a lot of nervous systems right now, but it's hard. I'm not sleeping. I keep going from sadness to grief to a tremendous amount of rage.
Okay, so we're going to move to more of the solution-based type things, guiding principles for social justice. Okay, so one of the principles that's needed to be clarified and implemented within the criminal justice system is a redefinition of the word justice. And I have a definition here, which I think fits for today's modern society, where the interests of every individual and those of society are inextricably linked by standards that apply equally to all. I like to use a metaphor example of this. So when you think about the human body and consider a single cell within the body. Now, a single cell has no significance outside of the body that it's serving. It's only in serving the body and in receiving from the body that cell has significance. And any cell that runs counter to that, we give that a name, right? We call that cancer. So racism and prejudice, they are cancers to the body of humanity, causing separation. Now we can see within the body, it's almost a metaphor for cooperation, reciprocity, and conciliation, but also a metaphor for justice, as all of the component parts of the body are both, they serve and receive. So justice needs to be redefined as every individual having equal status and say. Inclusion, acknowledgement of the oneness of mankind and the beauty of diversity. If the root cause of this illness is white supremacy, we need a more powerful ideology that thwarts that concept, right? And that would be this idea of the oneness of mankind, the belief that we are all one people with all of our diversity. So this idea of unity and diversity, but the idea is we need people entering the field of law enforcement who have a basic fundamental regard for the sanctity of life, right? For someone's humanity. No one should enter law enforcement without that belief, without that basic fundamental belief and understanding and feelings. And so this is something that's very, very key in this process, is having this basic belief in the oneness of mankind. Because when you think about it, the oneness of mankind, we're talking about a form of the way you're thinking, your level, your consciousness, how you view other people is based on your belief system, both conscious and unconscious belief systems, how you actually feel about other people. And acceptance of the spiritual principle of the oneness of mankind, not only does it provide each and every one of us with a global ethic or unifying vision of the nature of man and society, it also allows each and every individual to see differences in diversity as complementary aspects of one reality. So it's a way to shift our consciousness, or have a paradigm shift in how we see each other. Trust, firm belief in the reliability, integrity, truth, or strength of someone or something for which the stability of every human affair depends. Right? So law enforcement can't do their job without understanding that they have to have the trust of the community. And why do Black people not trust white officers, or officers in general, white or Black? Is because of that long-standing history. So law enforcement has to understand that history and be able to address and modify how they interact with people of color. Understanding that fear is founded, it's not unfounded fear, it's fear that is justified from 4 centuries of being oppressed, right? And us enforcing unfair laws, not only from slave codes to Black codes to Jim Crow laws, but also laws of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And that led to mass incarceration, how we enforce the drug laws, right? We have to be accountable for all those things. Lastly, collaboration, working jointly to produce positive outcomes that benefits everyone, right? This idea that we are part of one collective, right? And there shouldn't be this othering. There's like the police and there's the community, right? There should be this collaboration between both parties. Present-day conceptions of what is natural and appropriate in relationships among human beings themselves, with human beings and nature, between the individual and society, and between the members of society and institutions reflect levels of understanding arrived at by the human race during earlier and less mature stages in its development. If humanity is indeed coming of age, if all the inhabitants of the planet constitute a single people, if justice is to be the ruling principle of social organizations, then existing conceptions that were born out of ignorance of these emerging realities have to be recast. So we've created all of our institutions, remember that picture of structural racism, out of this false ideology. In order to really have a different society, we need to reimagine all of our institutions with this belief in the oneness of humanity. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but in order to reduce crime, we have to think reimagining law enforcement also means reimagining how we invest our priorities and time. And instead of investing in prison systems, which we do now, we should invest in education. Thank you, everyone. Olivia, I will turn it over to you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was such a rich and moving conversation. It's such a privilege to have you here with us today, Bob. I see we do have some questions in the Q&A box already. If you have others, please don't hesitate to write them during the intermission.
All right, well, welcome back. Again, Bob, we're just absolutely delighted to have you here. One of the questions I have is what are additional steps that can be taken to increase police accountability for misconduct?
Thanks for the question, David. And accountability is extremely important. I think accountability and transparency go hand in hand. But one of the things that I mentioned is that we need to do away with qualified immunity. I know that there's a bill in the House right now that they're trying to pass. It's in the process. Hopefully that goes through and is successful. And so we can overturn qualified immunity. That needs to happen. But what would replace it would be this. I believe it's very important for officers to be held accountable and having their own insurance, which a liability insurance, each individual officer carrying their own individual liability insurance. And we need to look at this thing like how a surgeon would, there's other professions are held accountable. And there's certain professions that cannot make mistakes. And one is, I started to mention it would be surgeons, pilots, and police officers. We cannot make mistakes. We need to be held to the highest standards of accountability. And can you imagine if a surgeon, committed some sort of malpractice, and there was a way in which he can get qualified immunity from that malpractice? But officers do. Second would be, in terms of accountability, is whenever you report any violation or misconduct to a police department, they have its own internal affairs department that investigates. I think every department should be governed when there's been a report of misconduct through a citizen review board, an independent board, so that we're not policing ourselves, people that we hang out with and socialize with. Policing the police, I don't think is effective. There needs to be a federal law coming into play, which would require anytime there's a use of force, particularly if something results in someone's death, that body camera and that footage of that has to be released to the media in a timely manner. We need to reform police unions, and we need to review and modify the police officer Bill of Rights. There's things in there that protect officers to the degree to which if an officer is performing unsatisfactorily or is not behaving like a true professional, that Bill of Rights actually protects even that officer. So we need to revise our police officer Bill of Rights as well. So it's a loaded question, but those are some of my reflections.
We hear that police need more training, but can that really lead to meaningful change if the officer has overt or covert racist thinking? How can we better vet? Are there tests given I know that there's a Harvard test for racial bias, for example. Are those tests used at this point in terms of bringing folks onto the police force? And if not, should we do that? And what else can we do?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that implicit bias is not something recognized by the criminal justice system overall, not just law enforcement. So I think the first step is it needs to be acknowledged as a real thing, that implicit bias is real. And the second part of that would be understanding how prejudice persists from generations to generations, and even within families, from generations to generations. It persists, as many of you know, through blind imitation. And there's this wonderful example used in the Baha'i writings that talks about the quote is, "In the garden of thy heart, plant not but the rose of love." And the reason why I mention that is, imagine our consciousness being analogous to a garden. And early on in your life, there's people planting things in this garden without your awareness, right? So you get your parents, you have culture, you have family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. Everybody's planting these sort of things in this child's garden, and at some point we need to look and acknowledge what's there. And so this is part of the process of also justice, where we then know our own knowledge and not through the knowledge of others, go look at what's there. So first of all, acknowledging again that it's a real thing. And in terms of vetting and figuring out how do you sort of screen for that, that's a more of a difficult challenge. There may be consideration, as you mentioned, David, of maybe including some implicit bias tests in the testing process. That needs to be included. But the first step is the system needs to acknowledge that it's a real thing. But certainly having those steps in place to sort of mitigate some of the volume of officers coming in who are really qualified to be officers based on those biases that they hold.
Here's a question. In the writings of Baha'u'llah, justice is discussed in different ways. In the hidden words, he says, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. By its aid thou shalt see, you were referring to this, with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. In another tablet, Baha'u'llah writes that the purpose of justice is unity. So how are these two references connected for you?
Okay, wonderful question. The first of all, fundamental to justice, whether it's operating within the individual or within society, is fairness. Fairness is the key. So as I mentioned, racism and prejudice, any forms of prejudice, it could be any form of prejudice, persists as a result of through blind imitation, sort of an aping of the past. So fairness would require, justice would require that you go back and look at what's actually present, right? That you can determine the truth for yourself. That would be a system of justice. So fair play. So now so that's at a micro level. At a macro level, we look at society, the way justice itself plays itself out is justice maintains, our collective order, right? So society isn't maintained through forgiveness. So I harm you, you harm me. It's done through forgiveness, right? We forgive each other, we move on. But society is held collectively through justice. And at the heart of justice is this, everything has to be done fairly. So if you're going to employ the forms of equity and inequality, right, as that has to be done fairly. So I think both are connected through process of fairness. And you can't have a society that's operating justly unless individuals are operating justly. So that's what I would share about that the two are directly connected through the processes of fairness.
Here's a question: your view on sort of the anti-movements such as anti-racist, anti-racism, does that perpetuate polarization and more disunity? Maybe just the framing of that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's wonderful. So there's a lot of scholarly work done in this idea of saying I'm a non-racist or saying I'm an anti-racist. So we know, to kind of explain this, it's we live in a society where white supremacy and this false ideology is prevalent. So racism and prejudice is like smog. Everyone is breathing this thing, but it impacts people in different ways, right? The impact may be slightly different for each individual. So we know that is something that is prevalent out there. So if everyone's breathing this thing, I think it's important to analyze how that impact is affecting all of us. And so if I say to myself, I'm a non-racist, that's almost a denying of the fact that you live in this society, right? Sort of this, like, it doesn't exist, almost a form of denial. And that kind of leads to colorblind racism, which I'm not going to get into unless we have time. But if you say I'm an anti-racist, you're saying that I'm honest. I'm looking at myself, and I'm gonna do all I can. I'm gonna take action on this within myself and within society, right? Casting it out. Like we have this, like, for example, the idea of mass incarceration. We need to get rid of mass incarceration. We need to get rid of qualified immunity. We need to rid ourselves both individually as well as collectively of this illness. And the only way to do that is to get honest with each other and say, I'm an anti-racist. And that's in fitting with behaving in a fair and just manner. I consider myself an anti-racist, and hopefully, David, you do too.
I definitely do. And I have no problem with the terminology. I think it's a strong terminology, and I think we need to take a strong position at this point. Here's a kind of a down to earth question. Some of the images that we see, there are people standing by filming. Often folks are frozen when they see sort of a violent activity going on. What can an individual do if they see police using what appears to be excessive force during an arrest?
All right, that's a great question. Number one is you don't want to directly get involved physically, because that could be you could be charged with a crime, or worse yet, you can actually be hurt severely or even killed. So you don't want to physically intervene when police officers are doing their job. But what you do want to do is use one of these. All right. And like the George Floyd trial, the reason why that was successful is because it was the phones are an objective reporter. So that's one. Record if you can, if possible, and report the misconduct. So you're now a witness to that misconduct. You can call the department. You can stick around and hopefully you'll be interviewed. If not, you can go down to the department and say, here's what I witnessed. And I think the George Floyd incident, where all those witnesses stopped by while he was basically pleading for his life, that was a perfect model of a community that was invested in protecting each other. It's really a beautiful thing. So that's just some of the things that came to mind on that question, is recording and sticking around as a witness.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, we're seeing things in real time now, and that definitely seems to be moving the needle. So in a world or a country that embraces a predatory sort of capitalistic system of profit over people, question, how can we overcome this to implement a system that appeals to our humanity as the norm?
Well, I think with what we need is a shifting of culture. This has to be addressed at the level of culture. This ideology of the true ideology and the oneness of mankind, that's an ideology, it's a belief system. So I think it's really important to, if we're going to change culture, to be able to implement this as a way in which we are trying to transform and reimagine our society. As I mentioned, structural racism is a real thing. And we look at all of our institutions, and as it says, as the old saying goes, that you don't put new wine in old bottles. So we need to transform the entire, I know this is a radical idea, but why not think radically about this? We need to transform the entire society and create a new culture based on this new ideology. So what this involves is, when you reimagine, then that naturally means you need to invite others impacted by any decisions you make through the process, through the consultative process. So as a former law enforcement officer, as I'm reimagining our criminal justice system, I'm listening very keenly to different people in different settings as to what kind of law enforcement they would like to see. And I'm keeping a catalog or a log, I'm keeping a track of and a log of all those different ideas, which are amazing ideas that I would never even think of. So if we want to reimagine the system, we have to also think not in terms of, us versus them, and we're going to, law enforcement, the criminal justice system, we need to sort of fix ourselves. We need to fix ourselves by inviting everyone to the table, that consultative model where we all are weighing in on what kind of law enforcement we want to see. Because ultimately, law enforcement is about serving the community, not serving ourselves.
Are you seeing more and more, I know you have eyes on this stuff, annual trainings, classes addressing racism in police departments among officers, maybe bringing community in? And is that something that could be nationalized, that could be a requirement? What are your thoughts about that?
From what I understand, there are some police departments that are making some significant changes, even starting with the police academy, some reforms happening there where they're trying to bring in community members to show officers how to interact with the community. And so there are those efforts being made, and some departments are moving further along than others and more advanced in the area of, we call it community building, right? Where you don't see yourself as a separate entity, but rather you see yourselves as jointly working with your community. It's literally impossible for a department to effectively do their jobs without the trust of the community. And one of the things that I'm doing as a personal project, along with others, is what I want to do is some of the aspects of what I shared today in the presentation is what I want to bring to law enforcement. Because when you poll the majority of African Americans in this country and you ask them, do you trust law enforcement? And do you think they're there to protect and serve you? The majority say no. You do ask the same question with white people and they say, yeah, they are there to protect and serve us. So clearly it seems we have two different criminal justice systems operating. And what I want what my fellow colleagues in law enforcement to understand is we need to take accountability for a long-standing history of 4 centuries of enforcing unfair laws, from slave codes to black codes to Jim Crow laws to many laws that are prevalent today. That's on us. And so it's created within the Black community a fear, a suspicion that's very real and founded, in a real way. In other words, it's not like, okay, this unfounded fear, like, where's it coming from? There's a reason why the Black men and people are feared. And that's why you have to be aware of, with this understanding of the history, then you can adjust how you interact with people of color. You may have to explain a little bit more when they ask you things like, simple things like, officer, why did you stop me? How about professionally telling them why? What's the harm in that? How about addressing them in such a way that you can sort of reduce their fear so that they have a different experience, right? They may have this fear, but after you as a professional officer interact with them, you can change and say, wow, that officer, no matter what color they were, they behaved professionally and did their job in a way that didn't make me feel small and little, as if I'm less than, right? So we need to get rid of this sort of mindset of within law enforcement of, we other people, as if we're, sort of this powerful force that's sort of coming down on the community with the hand of justice, right? That's not true justice, right? The badge is over your heart for a reason. So to be a just individual as a law enforcement officer, you also have to do your job with heart.
Let's talk a little bit about this whole concept of defunding the police, which has really kind of become, a very political issue, often misrepresented. So what are your thoughts about calls for defunding? Actually, there are a couple of questions in here. Defunding the police, and where do those funds get redirected? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that maybe the question requires me to sort of step back and look at the entire criminal justice system. So law enforcement is one component, but then you have prison systems, for example, and we're spending billions of dollars annually on prisoners and arresting people. And police are just sort of the hands and the feet to be able to put those people in those prisons. So we need to absolutely restructure. I would say, instead of defund, I would say restructure it, reprioritize, and once we stop making people products where we're using mass incarceration as a way to for these corporations, these private prisons to make money, right? People are actually making money on people being in prison. Once we need to rid ourselves of that. So that should actually be something that's from a federal level, that they say no more of that, and instead reinvest those funds in education, right? So right now our school systems, and if you go to many of these inner cities, I talk about the inner cities, right? With many of these inner cities are so impoverished, and they need, school systems are not only underfunded by the old antiquated laws of how schools are even funded, right, through property taxes. And if you live in an area that doesn't have, the houses aren't worth much, therefore the schools aren't going to have the funds they need and pay the teachers properly and enough resources. So it's a bigger issue than just defunding the police. We need to look at how to restructure. Remember, all of these things, structural racism, these things are all connected. So to say we need to defund the police is just one component of restructuring society and the society's resources.
Really want to thank you so much, Bob, for joining us and for sharing your experience and your heart with us today. And thank you to everybody for joining this conversation.